The river ice groaned like something dying. Caleb Thorne heard it crack from a quarter-mile off, the sound sharp enough to wake the crows from the willows. February cold had a way of making everything brittle. Branches, iron, men's patience. The air smelled of pine smoke from some distant cabin, and the wet leather of his saddle, still damp from yesterday's thaw. His mare snorted white clouds into the pre-dawn dark. He'd ridden out to mend fence. What he found instead was a child. She lay face down in the shallows where the ice had broken through, her small body half submerged, one arm stretched toward the current like she'd been reaching for something the river had already taken. Her lips were blue. Her dress, a faded calico, clung to her like a second skin of ice, and clutched in her white-knuckled fist was a leather satchel, dark with water, its brass buckle catching the weak morning light. Caleb dismounted fast. The frozen mud crunched under his boots as he waded in, the cold biting through wool and bone. He pulled her from the water. She weighed nothing, a bundle of sticks and soaked cloth, and pressed 2 fingers to her throat, a pulse. Faint, but there. He carried her through town at a run, past the shuttered storefronts and the bank with its polished windows. Vernon Giddings stood behind the glass, watching, didn't move, didn't open the door, just watched, his face smooth as that mahogany desk he kept so clean. The general store was already filling with early risers when Caleb kicked the door open. Doc laid her out on the counter. Esther Clay appeared from somewhere, her gray braids swinging as she moved, hands already reaching for blankets. The crowd pressed close, Mrs. Hewitt loudest among them. "What's a widower want with a girl child?" she said, loud enough the whole room could hear. Lord knows his intentions. Caleb's jaw worked, but he said nothing. His wedding ring caught lamplight as he checked the child's pulse again. Vernon stepped through the door then, hat in hand, his voice smooth as axle grease. "I'll take responsibility for the orphan," he said. "Proper Christian duty." "No," Caleb said. The crowd murmured. Vernon's smile didn't falter. The girl's eyes fluttered open. Hazel, wide with terror. Her lips moved, and the room fell silent to hear her. "Don't let the banker take the paper," she whispered, her voice like wind through broken glass. "Grandpa said, Mama and Papa sleeping by the willows." Then her eyes rolled back, and she was gone again. Esther worked through the morning in Caleb's barn loft, her hands steady despite the cold seeping through the walls. She'd turned the space into a makeshift sick room, piled wool blankets over fresh straw, set a pot of water to boil on the small iron stove Caleb used for winter calving. The smell of yarrow tea filled the air, sharp and medicinal, mixing with the scent of hay and horse sweat from the stalls below. Rosie lay beneath the blankets, her breathing shallow but steady. Esther had stripped the wet clothes, wrapped the child in flannel warmed by the stove, placed heated stones at her feet. The satchel sat on the floor beside the makeshift bed, still damp, its leather swollen with river water. Caleb stood by the ladder, useless. His calloused hands hung at his sides. He'd delivered 100 calves, set broken fence in blizzards, buried his wife with his own shovel. But standing here watching a child fight for breath, that was different. "She'll live," Esther said without looking up. "But she's been cold a long time, longer than just this morning." "What do you mean?" "I mean she's half starved. Look at her wrists." Esther pulled back the blanket enough to show the girl's arm. The bones stood out like fence posts. "This child hasn't eaten proper in weeks, maybe months." Caleb's throat tightened. She said something about her parents, by the willows. "I heard." Esther tucked the blanket back, her expression grim. "Willows grow thick upstream, 200 yards past the bend. If there's graves there, someone ought to look." The barn door creaked open below, boots on the ladder. Vernon Giddings climbed into the loft, his coat still clean despite the mud outside, his hat held politely in both hands. "Mr. Thorne," he said, nodding to Esther. "Ma'am, I've come to discuss the child's welfare." "She's resting," Caleb said. Of course, of course." Vernon moved closer, his eyes on the sleeping girl. "Tragic business, but I feel responsible, you understand. The Brenners, Silas and his son's family, they had accounts with my bank. I knew them well. It's only right I handle the girl's affairs." "Handle," Caleb repeated. "Guardianship, legal matters." Vernon's smile was practiced. "I know this is sudden, but winter's hard on a single man. Oz. You've got your own burdens. Ranch to run, debts to service. I could take the girl off your hands, place her somewhere proper. And, in return—" He paused, glancing at Caleb. "I'd be willing to forgive your March payment. $180. Consider it Christian charity. The barn was quiet except for the girls' breathing and the wind outside. No, Caleb said. Vernon's smile thinned. Think it over. You've got till weeks in before that payment comes due. A man in your position can't afford sentiment. He turned to leave, then paused at the ladder. Oh, and if the child wakes, do send word. I'll need to speak with her about her grandfather's estate. Legal formalities, you understand. His boots echoed down the rungs. The barn door shut. Esther waited until the sound of hooves faded. He's lying about something. I know. You also know you can't make that payment. Caleb looked at the girl. Her face was slack with fever sleep, but her hand still gripped the edge of the blanket like she was afraid it might vanish. I'll figure it out, he said. That night, after Esther had gone and the barn had settled into darkness, Caleb sat on an overturned crate beside the girl's bed. The stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, the wind rattled the loose boards he kept meaning to fix. He picked up the satchel. The leather was thick, good quality, the kind a man saved for. The buckle was tarnished but solid. He unbuckled it carefully, opened the flap. Inside, a few sheets of paper, the ink run to illegible smears. A small kerchief soaked through. A wooden button, nothing else, or so it seemed. But the satchel felt heavy, heavier than it should. Caleb ran his thumb along the inside bottom. The leather there was thicker, doubled maybe, stitched tight with small, careful stitches, a hiding place. He set the satchel down, his pulse quickening. Whatever was hidden there, Vernon wanted it, badly enough to offer $180 in forgiveness. Behind him, the girl stirred, her eyes opened, unfocused, staring at the rafters. Then she screamed. He poured something in Papa's coffee cup. He poured... Her voice broke into sobs. Caleb moved to her side, his hand hovering over her shoulder, unsure. You're safe, he said. Nobody's going to hurt you. But she kept crying, kept saying it. He poured something in the cup. Sunday came cold and bright. The church bell rang across the valley, its iron clang echoing off the hills. Caleb dressed in his one good shirt, the collar starched stiff by Esther's iron. Rosie wore a borrowed dress, too big in the shoulders, cinched at the waist with twine. Her fever had broken 2 days prior, but her eyes still carried that hollow, haunted look. The church smelled of beeswax and old wood. Families filed in, their boots scraping against the plank floor, their voices hushed in that Sunday morning way. Caleb took a seat in the back pew, Rosie pressed close to his side, her small hand gripping his sleeve. Mrs. Hewitt sat 3 rows ahead, her hat a monument of silk flowers and netting. She turned, her eyes sweeping over Caleb and the girl, then leaned to whisper something to the woman beside her. Both looked back, both frowned. The preacher opened with a hymn. The congregation rose, their voices lifting in uneven harmony. Rosie didn't sing. She stared at the floor, her lips moving soundlessly. Halfway through the sermon, something about charity and stewardship, she tugged on Caleb's sleeve. I need to tell him, she whispered. Tell who? The preacher. About the coffee. Caleb's chest tightened. After service. We'll talk to him after. But Rosie was already standing, already moving toward the aisle. Heads turned. The preacher stopped mid-sentence. Child? He said. Rosie walked to the front, her bare feet silent on the wood. When she reached the pulpit, she looked up at him, her voice clear enough to carry. The banker put something bad in my Papa's coffee, she said. At the camp by the river. Papa drank it and fell down. Mama drank it too. They both... Her voice cracked. She swayed, her face going white. Caleb was moving before she hit the floor, catching her before her head struck the boards. The congregation erupted. Gasps, whispers, the scrape of pews as people stood for a better view. Someone get Doc. Esther's voice cut through the noise. Caleb carried Rosie outside into the cold air. She was conscious but limp, her eyes glassy. He set her on the church steps, Esther already beside him with a flask of water. The preacher emerged, his face troubled. Behind him, Vernon Giddings, dressed in black wool, his expression one of practiced concern. Poor child, Vernon said, loud enough for the gathering crowd. Fever does terrible things to the mind, makes them see things that aren't there. She ain't fevered, Esther said sharply. Grief, then. Vernon's tone was smooth, reasonable. Tragic what happened to her parents. Typhoid, I heard. Terrible way to go, but the mind, especially a child's mind, it needs someone to blame, someone to make sense of senseless loss. The crowd murmured. Some nodded. Vernon reached into his coat, produced a leather billfold. Preacher, I'd like to make a donation. $50 toward the new church roof, in memory of the Brenner family. $50, half a month's wages for a ranch hand. The preacher's eyes widened. He took the bills with both hands, his voice thick with gratitude. God bless you, Mr. Giddings. This is true Christian generosity. Vernon smiled, his gaze sliding to Caleb. We all do what we can. Monday morning brought the marshal. Wade Pritchett rode up to the ranch at dawn, his badge catching the weak sunlight. He was a lean man, mid-30s, with a mustache that drooped past his jaw and eyes that gave nothing away. Caleb, he said, dismounting. Got some papers for you. He handed over a folded document, sealed with red wax. Caleb broke the seal, unfolded it. Legal language, dense and formal, but the meaning clear enough. Petition for guardianship. Vernon Giddings, executor of the estate of Silas Brenner, deceased. What is this? Vernon filed with the territorial clerk, Pritchett said. Says he's got a will, dated June of '82. Silas Brenner named him executor, gave him authority over any minor heirs. That's a lie. Maybe, but he's got the document. Signed, witnesses, town clerk verified the signature matches other papers Silas filed. Caleb read it again, slower. The signature at the bottom, a shaky X, the kind an old man with failing eyes might make, witnessed by a bank clerk named Horace Mills. I want to see this will, Caleb said. You got it right. But the law's the law, Caleb. Unless you got proof it's forged, Vernon's claim stands. Rosie appeared in the barn doorway, her borrowed dress fluttering in the wind. She walked toward them slowly, her eyes on the paper in Caleb's hand. Can I see? She asked. Caleb crouched, showed her the signature. She stared at it for a long moment, her brow furrowed. That's not Grandpa's mark, she said quietly. What do you mean? His X had a loop, at the bottom, like this. She traced the shape in the air with her finger, a small curl at the base of the letter. He showed me once, said it was special, so nobody could copy it. She pointed at the signature on the document. That one's straight. That's not his. Pritchett shifted his weight, his expression unreadable. Child testimony's tricky, he said carefully. Judges don't always credit it, especially against a man like Vernon. But you believe her, Caleb said. The marshal was quiet for a moment, then I believe she believes it. But believing and proving are different things. He swung back into the saddle. You got 30 days, Caleb. If Vernon contests this in court, I can't stop him. Not without evidence a judge will credit. He rode off, his horse's hooves muffled in the muddy snow. Rosie stood beside Caleb, her hand slipping into his. Her palm was small and cold. He's lying, she whispered. The banker. He's lying about everything. Caleb looked down at her, at the fierce certainty in her young face. I know, he said. Across the valley, smoke rose from the town. The bank's chimney, its plumes straight and steady in the still air. Esther Clay didn't believe in waiting for permission. Tuesday night, she borrowed a magnifying glass from the school teacher and made her way to the town clerk's office just after sunset. The clerk, a nervous man named Tobias Finn, thin as a fence post and twice as rigid, was locking up when she arrived. Mrs. Clay, he said, startled. Bit late for business. Won't take but a minute, Esther said, pushing past him into the office. The room smelled of ink and dust and the coal oil lamp Tobias kept burning on his desk. Shelves lined the walls, stuffed with ledgers and deed books and papers tied with string. I need to see the Brenner will, she said. The one Vernon filed. Tobias hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing. That's sealed documentation. Pending legal. Tobias, Esther's voice could strip paint when she wanted it to. Your wife had a breech birth last spring. I sat with her 14 hours while you paced holes in your kitchen floor. You remember that? He remembered. His shoulders sagged. 5 minutes, he muttered, pulling a key from his vest. He unlocked a drawer, withdrew a thin folder, and handed it over. Esther spread the will on the desk, angled the lamp close, and lifted the magnifying glass. The document was simple. 3 paragraphs, all in Vernon's neat clerk hand except for the signature at the bottom. That shaky X, dark and bold against the yellowed paper. She leaned closer. The ink was black, pure black, the kind that came from a fresh bottle. Tobias, she said slowly. You know anything about iron gall ink? Some. It's what most legal documents use, turns brown after a year or two, fades to rust color if it's old enough. This ink's black. So? So this will's dated June 1882, near 2 years back. Ink should be brown by now. She tilted the glass, studying the signature's edges. And look here. See how the ink's bled into the paper fibers? That happens when ink's fresh. Old ink sits on top, doesn't bleed like this. Tobias leaned over her shoulder, his breath catching. You saying it's forged? I'm saying the ink's too fresh for a 2-year-old document. He stepped back, his face gone pale. Mrs. Clay, I can't. Vernon holds my brother's farm note. $300. If I testify against him, he'll call it due. My brother's got 6 children and a sick wife. He can't pay that kind of money. Esther folded the will carefully, handed it back. I'm not asking you to testify. Not yet. But you keep that will safe. And if someone asks you official-like whether the ink seems right, you tell the truth. Tobias nodded, his hands shaking as he locked the drawer. Outside, the night air smelled of wood smoke and coming snow. Esther pulled her shawl tight and walked to the edge of town where Caleb was waiting with his wagon. Well, he said. Ink's wrong, too fresh. Vernon forged it, near certain. Caleb's jaw clenched. Will Tobias say so in court? Not unless we find a way to protect his brother. Vernon's got half this town by the throat with loans and favors. They're all afraid. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon wheels creaking through mud and slush. The stars were bright overhead, the kind of cold, clear sky that promised frost by morning. What about the marshal? Caleb asked. What about him? You think he'd listen if we showed him the ink? Esther considered. Pritchett's a lawman, follows rules, but he's not stupid. And he's got a daughter, 8 years old, same as Rosie. Saw him watching that girl in church. The way she spoke up. I think it got to him. The next afternoon, Marshal Pritchett rode out to the Thorn Ranch. He found Caleb mending fence in the north pasture, Rosie nearby gathering stones to mark the post holes. The girl moved slowly, carefully, like someone still learning to trust the ground under her feet. Got a minute? Pritchett called. Caleb drove the post one more time, then walked over, wiping sweat from his face despite the cold. Marshal? Need to talk to the girl, alone, if that's all right. Caleb looked at Rosie. She'd stopped gathering stones, her eyes on the marshal. After a moment, she nodded. They walked to the edge of the pasture, where a fallen cottonwood made a natural bench. Pritchett sat, motioned for Rosie to join him. She perched on the log like a bird ready to fly. Rosie, he said gently, I need you to tell me about your parents, about what happened at the river camp. Her hands twisted in her lap. Papa said we were going to see Grandpa. It was late, almost dark. We stopped by the Willows to make coffee and eat supper. Who made the coffee? Mama. She always made it, but... Rosie's voice dropped to a whisper. The banker came. Mr. Giddings, he said he was riding past, saw our fire. Papa invited him to sit. He was... polite. He talked about Grandpa's land, about buying it. What did your papa say? Said no. Said Grandpa would never sell. It was family land. For me, when I grew up. She swallowed hard. The banker smiled, said he understood. Then he asked if he could have some coffee. Mama poured him a cup. He drank a little, then said it was too hot. Set it down, started talking about the weather. Pritchett waited. Then Mama turned away to check the beans, and I saw... Her voice broke. I saw him pour something from a little bottle into Papa's cup, and Mama's. Just a little, like sugar, but it wasn't sugar. What happened next? Papa drank his coffee, Mama drank hers, the banker left, said goodnight, rode away. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Then Papa grabbed his stomach, fell down. Mama tried to help him, but she fell too. They were shaking, making terrible sounds. I tried to wake them, but they wouldn't wake up. Pritchett's hands were fists on his knees. How'd you end up in the river? I ran to get Grandpa, but it was so far, and it was dark, and I fell through the ice. I don't remember after that, just cold, and someone pulling me out. The marshal stood slowly. He looked across the pasture to where Caleb waited, then back at the girl. Rosie, he said, can you show me where this camp was? Where your parents are buried? She nodded. All right, we'll ride out tomorrow, you, me, and Mr. Thorne. We'll find those graves. And if your story matches what we find, he put his hat back on, then I'm declaring you under emergency protective custody. 30 days, pending investigation. Vernon can file all the papers he wants, but until I finish looking into this, You stay with Caleb. Rosie's face crumpled with relief. You believe me? I believe something bad happened, and I believe you're telling the truth as you know it. He tipped his hat. That's enough for now. He walked back to his horse, mounted, then looked down at Caleb. If Vernon contests this in territorial court, I got no legal grounds to hold him off permanent, he said. But 30 days buys us time. Use it. He rode off, his horse's hooves splashing through the half-frozen puddles. Rosie ran to Caleb, wrapped her arms around his waist. He stood there, awkward, then slowly rested one hand on her head. Across the valley, the bank's windows glowed with lamplight. Vernon would hear about this by morning, and when he did, he'd come. Vernon moved faster than Caleb expected. Thursday morning, a rider brought a notice from the bank, sealed with red wax and written in that neat, bloodless script. Payment due March 15th, accelerated to March 8th per revised terms. Failure to remit $180 principal plus $45 accrued interest, $225 total, will result in forfeiture of collateral property as stipulated in original loan agreement. Caleb read it twice. March 8th was 6 days away. The revised terms clause sat at the bottom in small print. Borrower's assumption of additional household dependence constitutes material change in financial circumstance, permitting lender to demand immediate satisfaction of outstanding obligations. Esther stood in the doorway, flour on her hands from making biscuits. He's choking you out. I know. You got $225? Caleb looked at her. They both knew the answer. The bull, he said finally. The Hereford. He's worth $220, maybe more at spring auction. Spring auction's not for 2 months. Then I'll sell him private. Today. By noon, word had spread. A thorn bull for sale, immediate purchase, best offer. Men gathered at the auction yard on the edge of town. Ranchers, speculators, anyone with cash and an eye for livestock. The Hereford stood in the center ring, broad-shouldered and placid, his red coat gleaming in the weak sunlight. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man named Kowalski, climbed onto the platform. Fine animal, 3 years old, proven breeder. We'll start at $200. A hand went up. Silas Drummond, who ran cattle on the East Range. $200, Drummond called. Another hand. $210. Then silence. The crowd shifted, uneasy. Caleb scanned the faces. Vernon's hired men stood at the back, 3 of them arms crossed, expressions blank. Come on, gentlemen, Kowalski said. This bull's worth $250 easy. More silence. Drummond cleared his throat. 210's my final. Anyone else? Kowalski's eyes swept the crowd. No one moved. Going once? 220, a voice called from the back. Heads turned. Jacob Brenner stepped forward. A young man, mid-20s, with dark hair and shoulders built for hard work. Caleb recognized him vaguely. Hired hand for one of the ranches north of town. 220, Jacob repeated. Drummond shook his head, stepped back. Sold, Kowalski said, bringing his gavel down. Caleb met Jacob by the ring gate. The young man counted out the bills slowly, worn and creased, like they'd been folded and refolded 100 times. You're short, Ace, Caleb said, finishing the count. This is only 160. Jacob's face went red. That's all I got. I heard you needed it quick, so I figured. You figured wrong. Caleb handed the money back. Keep your bull money. I'll find another buyer. But there were no other buyers. The crowd had already dispersed, men climbing into wagons and riding off without looking back. Vernon's men were the last to leave, their horses moving slow and deliberate past the auction ring. Caleb stood there in the empty yard, the Hereford's lead rope in his hand, the smell of manure and hay thick in the cold air. He'd gambled and lost. $225 due in 6 days, and he had $63 in a tin box under his bed. The bull lowed softly, its breath steaming. Saturday brought the town meeting. Emergency session, called by the mayor at Vernon's request. The courthouse was packed, standing room only, the air thick with body heat and the smell of wet wool. Caleb stood near the back, Rosie beside him. Esther had taken a seat up front, her spine rigid with anger. Vernon sat at the council table, flanked by 2 men in city suits, lawyers from the territorial capital, their faces pale and soft like they'd never seen a day's work. Mayor Hutchins gavelled the room to silence. We're here regarding the guardianship matter of Rosalie Brenner, orphaned minor. Mr. Giddings has petitioned for immediate custody based on legal documentation. Mr. Thorne has been granted temporary custody by Marshal Pritchett. The council will hear arguments and vote on the matter. One of the lawyers stood. Honorable council members, we represent Mr. Giddings in his capacity as executor of the Brenner estate, we submit for your review the last will and testament of Silas Brenner, properly witnessed and notarized, which clearly designates Mr. Giddings as guardian of any minor heirs. He slid a document across the table. The mayor examined it, passed it to the council members. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, we submit this deed of sale, dated January 1881, wherein Silas Brenner conveyed his homestead property, 160 acres along the Willow River, to Giddings Bank and Land Company for the sum of $1 in satisfaction of outstanding seed loans and other debts. He produced another document, this one older, the paper yellowed, the ink faded to brown. Caleb's stomach dropped. $1. The old man's land sold for $1. That's a lie, Rosie said, loud enough to carry. Heads turned. The lawyer smiled, indulgent. The child is understandably confused. Grief effects. He's lying. Rosie pulled away from Caleb, pushed through the crowd to the front. Grandpa never sold the land. He told Mama it was mine. He showed her the paper with the gold stamp. Rosalie, Caleb started forward, but she was already at the council table, her small hands flat on the wood, her face flushed with fury. Mama said the paper had a gold stamp and a ribbon, and Grandpa's name written in fancy letters, and it said the land was ours forever because the president signed it. He never sold it. Not for $1, not for anything. Vernon leaned forward, his voice gentle. Sweetheart, I know this is hard, but your grandfather had debts. Sometimes good men make difficult choices to protect their families. You're lying, Rosie said, her voice breaking. You killed my mama and papa, and now you're stealing from Grandpa. The room erupted, voices shouting, some defending Vernon, others demanding answers. Hutchins gavelled for order, the sound sharp as gunfire. Marshal Pritchett stood from where he'd been leaning against the wall. Enough, his voice cut through the noise. The child has made a serious accusation. Before this council votes on anything, I want that Riverside camp examined. I want those graves opened. And I want Doc to look at the bodies. Vernon's smile never wavered. Marshal, I understand your concern, but the Brenners died of typhoid. Opening graves risks contamination, and as for the child's testimony, he spread his hands. She's traumatized, confused. It's natural she'd seek someone to blame. I'm not confused, Rosie screamed. I saw you pour it in the cup. Hutchins brought the gavel down hard. Order, Miss Brenner, sit down. But he... Sit down. Caleb reached Rosie, pulled her back. She fought him, her small fists pounding his chest, her voice dissolving into sobs. The crowd watched, some with pity, some with suspicion, all of them uncertain. The council voted, 3-2 in favor of Vernon's petition, pending judicial review. Hutchins cleared his throat. However, in light of Marshal Pritchett's concerns, we'll allow the temporary custody arrangement to stand for 30 days while the marshal conducts his investigation. After that, absent compelling evidence to the contrary, custody will transfer to Mr. Giddings as executor. Vernon stood, nodded to the council. Thank you, gentlemen. I trust justice will prevail. He walked past Caleb on his way out, paused just long enough to murmur, 6 days, Thorne. Don't forget. The courthouse emptied slowly. Caleb stood in the cold evening air, Rosie clutched against his side, her face pressed to his coat. Across the street, the bank's windows glowed warm and golden. Esther joined them, her jaw set. That deed's a forgery, too. I'd stake my life on it. Can you prove it? Caleb asked. She didn't answer. They both knew she couldn't. Not in 6 days, not in 30. Behind them, Mrs. Hewitt's voice carried from the courthouse steps. Poor child's been twisted up by that rancher. Filling her head with accusations, it's shameful, really. Caleb felt Rosie's shoulders shake with silent tears. Come on, he said quietly. Let's go home. They walked to the wagon, the mud sucking at their boots. The stars were coming out overhead, cold and distant, and somewhere upstream, past the willows, 2 graves lay unmarked in the frozen ground. Sunday afternoon, Caleb hitched the wagon and drove Rosie north along the river road. The day was warmer than it had been, the kind of false spring that came in late February, when the sun felt almost kind and the ice along the banks began to weep. The smell of thawing earth mixed with pine and the faint rot of last year's leaves. They rode in silence. Rosie sat beside him, her borrowed coat pulled tight, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Where are we going? She asked finally. To see your grandfather. She turned to look at him, confusion crossing her face. Grandpa's dead. I know. But Esther says he's still laid out at his cabin. Hasn't been buried yet. Ground's too frozen. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. Thought maybe you'd want to say goodbye proper. Rosie nodded slowly, her hands twisted in her lap. The cabin sat in a clearing a mile off the main road, its log walls dark with age and weather. Smoke still rose from the chimney. Esther had been keeping the fire going, making sure the old man's body didn't freeze solid before they could bury him come spring. She met them at the door, her face drawn. He's in the back room. I've done what I can to make him presentable. Caleb followed Rosie inside. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and something else, the sweet, faint smell of decay held at bay by cold. Silas Brenner lay on a narrow bed, his hands folded across his chest, his face sunken in gray. Someone had combed his hair, trimmed his beard. He looked smaller in death, like the life had been the only thing holding his bones together. Rosie stood in the doorway, not moving. Caleb stayed behind her, giving her space. "Grandpa," she whispered finally, then louder. "Grandpa, I'm sorry. I tried to get to you, but the ice broke, and I fell in, and—" Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry." Caleb's throat tightened. He looked away, out the window to where the last snow clung to the north side of the trees. Rosie moved closer to the bed. She reached out, touched her grandfather's folded hands. They were cold and stiff, the knuckles swollen with years of work. "The banker's trying to take your land," she said quietly. "He says you sold it, but I know you didn't. I know you wouldn't." She leaned closer. "Mama said you told her the truth sewn in her needlework. She always hid important things in the stitching." Her brow furrowed. She repeated the words like she was trying to make sense of them. "In the stitching. In the stitching." Then her eyes widened. "The satchel." She turned to Caleb. "Mama made that satchel. She sewed it herself. She was always sewing things, dresses, blankets, bags. She said a woman who could sew never went hungry because she could always trade her work." "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked. "Grandpa said the truth's in her needlework. What if he meant—" She trailed off, her face flushed with sudden urgency. "We have to go. We have to go now." Outside, the sun had started its long slide toward the horizon. The shadows stretched thin and blue across the snow. Esther walked with them to the wagon. What did she figure out? "Don't know yet," Caleb said, "but something." Esther nodded. She pulled something from her apron pocket, a small leather notebook worn at the edges. "I found this in Silas's things. It's a record book, where he kept notes on his land dealings, seed purchases, that sort of thing." She handed it to Caleb. "Last entries from December, 2 months before he died, says VG came again, offered $500 for the homestead, told him no, Lancer. Showed him the patent to prove it's mine, free and clear. He wasn't happy." Caleb's jaw clenched. VG Vernon Giddings. That's my guess. Means Vernon knew Silas had the original patent, knew the land was never sold, and still tried to claim it with a forged deed. Why would he want it so bad? It's decent land, but nothing special. Esther's eyes were hard. "I asked around. Railroads surveying a route through this valley. If they come through, they'll need to buy right of way. Land along the Willow River's about to be worth 10 times what it is now, maybe more." Caleb looked at Rosie, sitting in the wagon, her face pale but determined. A 9-year-old girl standing between a banker and a fortune. "He'll kill her if he has to," Caleb said quietly. "I know." Esther's voice was steady. "That's why we can't let him." That evening, in the barn by lamplight, Caleb and Rosie examined the satchel. Esther had come too, and Marshall Pritchett, summoned by a note Caleb had sent with a neighbor boy. The satchel lay on a workbench, its leather dried and stiff from the river water. Caleb turned it over slowly, running his fingers along the seams. "Here," Rosie said, pointing to the bottom. "See how the stitching's different, smaller, tighter." Caleb leaned close. She was right. The bottom panel had been sewn with thread finer than the rest, the stitches so small and precise they were almost invisible. He pulled his knife from his belt. "May I?" Rosie nodded. He worked the blade carefully under the stitches, cutting them one by one. The thread parted with soft pops. Beneath the outer layer of leather was another, a false bottom, sewn in with the same meticulous care, and folded inside that hidden space. A document. Caleb pulled it out gently. The paper was thick, official, untouched by water. He unfolded it on the bench. At the top, in ornate script, United States of America, homestead patent. Below that, be it known that Silas James Brenner, having complied with all requirements of the Homestead Act of 1862, is hereby granted full title to 160 acres in Montana Territory. At the bottom, a gold seal, embossed and gleaming, a red ribbon, and 2 signatures, one from the Territorial Land Office, one from a federal administrator. Marshal Pritchett let out a low whistle. That's the real thing. Original patent. Silas owned that land free and clear. No sale, no lien, nothing. Rosie was crying again, but this time with relief. I told you Grandpa didn't sell. Esther squeezed the girl's shoulder. You did good, honey. You kept it safe. Caleb looked at Pritchett. This proves Vernon's deed is forged. It does, but here's the problem. We show this to Vernon, he'll find a way to destroy it or claim it's fake. We need to present it publicly, with witnesses, where he can't touch it. The hearing, Esther said. 30 days from now, in front of the whole council. Pritchett nodded slowly. That could work, but until then Vernon can't know we have this, and he sure as hell can't know where you're keeping it. Caleb folded the patent carefully, slipped it back into the false bottom. I'll keep it here, in the barn, under lock. No. Pritchett's voice was firm. He'll search this place top to bottom if he suspects. We need somewhere safer. Esther straightened. My house. I'll sew it into my mattress ticking. Vernon Giddings won't come near my bedroom, and even if he did, he'd never think to look there. It was decided. Esther took the patent, wrapped it in oilcloth, and tucked it under her coat. She left just after dark, her buggy rattling down the frozen road. Caleb walked Pritchett to his horse. The marshal swung into the saddle, then looked down. 6 days till your payment's due, he said. I know. You got the money? Caleb shook his head. Pritchett was quiet for a moment. Then he'll take the ranch, and once he does, he'll take the girl too. Says you're unfit if you can't keep a roof over her head. I'm working on it. Work faster. The marshal rode off into the dark. Inside the barn, Rosie sat on a hay bale, her arms wrapped around her knees. Caleb sat beside her. Are we going to lose? She asked quietly. No, but you don't have the money. I'll find it. She looked at him, her eyes old beyond her years. What if you can't? Caleb didn't have an answer for that. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn door. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The rumor started Tuesday morning. By noon, it had spread through town like creek water in spring flood. Caleb heard it first from the blacksmith, who heard it from the barber, who heard it from Mrs. Hewitt at the general store. They're saying you took that girl for ranch labor, the blacksmith said, not meeting Caleb's eyes as he shod the mare. The forge glowed red behind him, the smell of hot iron and hoof smoke thick in the air. Saying you needed help with calving season and figured an orphan was cheaper than hiring a hand. Caleb's hands tightened on the mare's lead rope. That's a damn lie. I know it, but half the town don't. The blacksmith set down his hammer, wiped sweat from his face. Vernon's got people talking. Says you're using her to work off your debt. Says it ain't Christian. By afternoon, the whispers had grown teeth. At the feed store, the clerk wouldn't meet Caleb's eyes. At the bank, where he'd gone to try one last time to negotiate the payment, the teller told him Mr. Giddings was unavailable. Walking back to the wagon, Caleb passed 3 women on the boardwalk. Their conversation died the moment they saw him. One of them clutched her shopping bag closer like he might snatch it. He loaded the feed sacks alone, his jaw aching from clenching. That evening, a rider came to the ranch. Young man, early 20s, sitting his horse like someone who'd rather be anywhere else. He wore work clothes, canvas pants, wool coat, hat pulled low. When he dismounted, Caleb saw the resemblance immediately. The dark hair, the shape of the jaw. Silas Brenner's blood ran in this one. Help you? Caleb said from the porch. Name's Jacob Brenner. The young man's voice was tight with nerves. I was Silas's nephew, his brother's boy. Caleb waited. Jacob shifted his weight. Mr. Giddings sent me. Said you got something that don't belong to you. Said I'm to retrieve it and bring it to the bank for safekeeping. That so? Yes, sir. Jacob's hand moved to his coat pocket. He gave me a letter, says it's legal authority to... Stop. Caleb's voice was flat. He stepped down from the porch. You pull that letter out, we're going to have a problem. Jacob's hand froze. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Jacob's shoulders sagged. I don't want to be here, he said quietly. But Vernon, he holds my gambling debts. $130. If I don't do what he says, he'll call them due, and I can't pay that kind of money. So you're here to steal from a 9-year-old girl, Jacob flinched. It ain't stealing if it's family property. I'm kin. I got more right to Silas's things than some stranger. That what you tell yourself? The barn door opened. Rosie stepped out, a bucket of kitchen scraps in her hands for the chickens. She stopped when she saw Jacob, her eyes going wide. You, she whispered. Jacob turned. His face went pale. You got Grandpa's eyes, Rosie said, moving closer. The bucket hung forgotten in her hand. And his chin. Who are you? Jacob's voice cracked. I'm your cousin, your papa's cousin. My daddy was Silas's brother. Rosie stared at him. Grandpa never talked about you. We had a falling out, long time ago. Jacob looked at the ground. I did some things I ain't proud of. Gambling, mostly. Got in debt. Grandpa said I was wasting my life. We stopped speaking. Why are you here now? Jacob was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. Vernon sent me, to get the satchel, the one you were carrying when Caleb found you. Rosie's hand tightened on the bucket handle. So you can give it to him? So he don't call my debts. And what happens to me? Jacob met her eyes finally. In them was shame so deep it looked like drowning. I don't know. The wind picked up, cold and sharp. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed. My mama's dead, Rosie said, her voice steady despite the tears starting down her cheeks. My papa's dead, Grandpa's dead, and the man who killed them sent you here to take the only thing I got left that proves this land is mine. She took a step closer. Are you gonna do it? Jacob's face crumpled. He turned away, one hand pressed to his eyes. I can't, he said finally. God help me, I can't. He looked at Caleb, his voice urgent now. Vernon's planning something. Tonight, he's hiring men, drifters from the railroad camps. Says he needs the ranch secured. Says you're dangerous, keeping a child against her will. Secured how? Caleb asked. I don't know exactly, but I heard him tell one of them to bring coal oil and matches. Jacob's eyes were desperate. He's going to burn your barn, Caleb, make it look like an accident. Then he'll say you're unfit, can't protect the girl. He'll take her into custody before morning. The air seemed to crystallize, every sound suddenly sharp, the chickens scratching in the dirt, the creak of the barn door in the wind. Rosie's breathing, quick and shallow. When? Caleb asked. Midnight, maybe sooner. He's got 3 men hired, hard types who'll do whatever he pays for. Jacob mounted his horse, his movements jerky with fear. I can't testify against him. He'd ruin me, but I can't watch a barn burn with a child inside neither. He looked at Rosie one more time. I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. He rode off into the gathering dusk, his horse's hooves muffled in the mud. Esther arrived within the hour, summoned by a neighbor boy Caleb had sent running. She took one look at his face and started giving orders. Get the girl to my house, now. He won't burn a barn with half the town watching, so we make sure there's witnesses. How? We tell people, everyone we trust. We tell them there's trouble coming and they need to be here. She turned to Rosie. Go pack what you need, honey. You're staying with me tonight. No. Rosie's voice was firm. I'm staying here. This is my fight, too. Child. I said no. Her jaw set in a way that reminded Caleb of Silas. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of hiding. If he wants to burn this barn, let him try, but I'm staying. Esther looked at Caleb. He saw his own helplessness reflected in her eyes. All right, he said finally, but you stay in the house. Doors locked. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understood? Rosie nodded. By 9 o'clock, word had spread. 6 men arrived. Neighbors, ranch hands, men who owed Caleb nothing but came anyway. They positioned themselves around the barn, in pairs, hidden in shadow, rifles across their knees. Esther stayed in the house with Rosie. Through the window, Caleb could see lamplight and the girl's silhouette moving back and forth. Marshal Pritchett arrived at 10, his badge hidden beneath his coat. Officially, I'm not here, he said. But if Vernon's men start a fire, I'll arrest every last one of them. The temperature dropped as midnight approached. The stars were hard and bright overhead, the kind of sky that hurt to look at. The smell of horses and gun oil mixed with the cold. Caleb waited on the barn roof, lying flat against the shingles, his rifle beside him. From here, he could see the road, the house, the dark shapes of his neighbors keeping watch. At 11:30, 3 riders appeared. They moved slow and cautious, their faces obscured by hat brims and scarves. One carried a torch, not yet lit. Another had a canvas sack slung over his saddle, heavy, sloshing with liquid, coal oil. They dismounted 100 yards out, tied their horses, started moving toward the barn on foot. Caleb waited until they were 20 feet away. Then he stood, silhouetted against the stars, and jacked a round into his rifle. The sound echoed like a thunderclap. "That's far enough." The 3 men froze. Around the barn, 6 more rifles cocked in sequence. One of the men dropped the sack. Coal oil spilled across the frozen ground, its sharp smell cutting through the night air. "Now," Caleb said, his voice carrying across the silence, "you boys are going to turn around real slow and ride back to whoever paid you. And you're going to tell him his plan failed." The men didn't move. Then from the darkness behind them, Marshal Pritchett's voice rang out. "Do what the man says, or spend the night in my jail." The riders backed away slowly, found their horses, rode off into the dark. The neighbors emerged from their hiding places. Someone lit a lamp. The barn stood untouched, its walls solid and whole. Inside the house, Rosie pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the glass. Caleb climbed down from the roof, his legs shaking with spent adrenaline. Esther met him at the door. "It's not over," she said quietly. "I know." In the distance, they could hear the riders retreating, but somewhere beyond them, in his office above the bank, Vernon Giddings would be waiting, planning his next move, and in 3 days the payment would come due. Wednesday morning dawned gray and cold. Caleb woke to the smell of smoke. Not fresh fire, but the acrid stink of something burned hours ago and still smoldering. He dressed quickly, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The barn still stood, but across the yard, the chicken coop was gone. Just charred posts and blackened wire, still steaming in the morning air. The hens were scattered across the pasture, clucking nervously. One lay dead near the ruins, its feathers singed. Rosie stood at the fence line in her nightdress and Caleb's coat, staring at the destruction. Her face was blank with exhaustion. "They came back," she said when Caleb reached her. "After everyone left. Around 3. I heard horses, but I was too scared to look." Caleb's jaw clenched. The neighbors had stayed until past 1, then gone home to their own chores, their own troubles. Vernon's men had waited them out. "It's a warning," Esther said, coming up behind them. She'd stayed the night in the house, sleeping in the chair by the stove. "He's saying next time it'll be worse." Marshal Pritchett arrived mid-morning, examined the ruins, took notes. His face was grim. "I'll file a report, but without witnesses, without proof who did it." He trailed off. They all knew. Reports didn't stop men like Vernon. By noon, the preacher came calling. Reverend Michaels was a soft-spoken man with thin gray hair and hands that shook slightly when he held his Bible. He found Caleb in the barn, mucking stalls. "Caleb," he said, removing his hat, "might I have a word?" They walked to the fence line. The preacher was quiet for a long moment, watching the cattle graze in the far pasture. "The council's concerned," he said finally. "About the girl. About the escalation of tensions." "Tensions?" Caleb repeated flatly. "The fire last night. The accusations flying back and forth. People are taking sides. It's dividing the community." The preacher's voice was pained. "Some folks are saying, well, they're saying maybe it'd be better for everyone if the girl went to Mr. Giddings. At least until the courts can sort out the legal matters. It would ease the pressure, let things calm down." Caleb stared at him. "You're saying I should give her up." "I'm saying the town's turning, Caleb. Half these people owe Vernon money. The other half are scared of him. And every day this drags on, it gets worse." The preacher met his eyes. "I know you mean well, but sometimes doing right by a child means knowing when to step aside. Even if stepping aside means handing her to the man who killed her parents. We don't know that for certain. The girl's testimony is what? Too young? Too traumatized? Too inconvenient?" Caleb's voice was rising. "You were there when she spoke in church. You saw her face. You think she's lying?" The preacher's shoulders sagged. "I think she believes what she's saying, but belief and proof aren't the same thing, and without proof—" He put his hat back on. "The council's voting tomorrow to remove her from your custody. I wanted you to hear it from me first." He walked back to his buggy, climbed in, and drove away without looking back. That afternoon, the sky opened up. Not snow, the temperature had climbed just enough, but cold rain that drummed on the barn roof and turned the yard to soup. Water dripped through the gaps in the shingles, pooling on the floor. One of the posts near the door had started to rot, Caleb noticed, another expense he couldn't afford. He sat on a hay bale, head in his hands, listening to the rain. The payment was due in 2 days. He had $63. The council would vote tomorrow to take Rosie. And somewhere in town, Vernon Giddings sat warm and dry behind his polished desk, winning. The barn door creaked. Rosie slipped inside, soaked to the skin despite the coat. She didn't say anything, just sat beside him on the hay bale. They sat in silence, listening to the rain. "I'm sorry," she said finally. Caleb looked at her. "For what?" "For being trouble. For making you lose your ranch. For—" her voice broke. "For everything. You got nothing to be sorry for. But if I wasn't here, you'd still have your money. You'd still have your barn and your chickens, and I'd be alone," Caleb said quietly. "Like I've been for 8 years, waking up with nothing to work for except another day of not dying." He turned to face her. "You didn't take anything from me, Rosie. You gave me something. I just wish I was strong enough to keep it." She leaned against his side, small and damp and shivering. He put his arm around her shoulders, awkward but sure. Outside, the rain fell harder. Thunder rumbled in the distance. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Caleb didn't answer. He didn't have one. That night, by lamplight, Rosie wouldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table, the satchel in front of her, running her fingers over the leather. "Grandpa said Mama hid the truth in her stitching," she said for the 100th time. "We found the patent, but what if there's more?" "More what?" "I don't know, something else. Something we missed." She picked up the satchel, held it to the light. The leather was dry now, stiff in places where the water had soaked deepest. She traced the stitching along the edges, the handle, the flap. Then she stopped. "This doesn't match," she said slowly. "What doesn't?" "The stitching on the flap. Look, the rest of the satchel is sewn with brown thread. But the flap—" She held it closer. "The flap's sewn with black thread. Why would Mama use different thread?" Caleb leaned in. She was right. The stitching was subtly different, darker, slightly thicker. "Maybe she ran out of brown," he said. But Rosie was already working her fingernail under the stitches, pulling gently. The thread was newer than the rest, less weathered. It came loose easier. She peeled back the flap's outer layer. Underneath, pressed flat against the inner leather, a folded piece of paper. Caleb's heart hammered. "What is it?" Rosie unfolded it carefully. The paper was newer than the patent, written in a woman's careful hand. A letter. "My dearest Rosie, if you are reading this, then something has happened to your father and me. I pray you never need to see these words, but your grandfather insisted I prepare for the worst, and he was always the wisest man I knew. The land patent is hidden in the satchel bottom, as Grandpa showed me. But there is something else you must know. Mr. Giddings came to our camp 3 times, asking to buy Grandpa's land. Each time, your father refused. The last time, Mr. Giddings became angry. He said the railroad was coming through, that the land would be worth thousands, and that one way or another, he would have it. Your father told him to leave. Mr. Giddings said, 'Then I'll wait for you to die, or I'll help you along if you take too long.' I wrote this down the next day and gave it to Grandpa for safekeeping. He said to hide it where only you would think to look. He said if anything happened to us, this letter and the patent together would be enough to prove the truth. Be brave, my darling girl. Be strong, and remember, your grandfather's land is yours by right and by blood. Let no one take it from you. All my love, Mama." Rosie's hands shook as she finished reading. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but her voice was steady. "It's proof," she whispered. Mama wrote down what he said. She dated it. February 10th, 1883, 2 weeks before they died. Caleb took the letter gently, read it through twice. His throat was tight. "We take this to Pritchett," he said, "tonight. Will it be enough?" "It has to be." Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing stars sharp and cold in the midnight sky. And across the valley, in the darkness, a single light burned in the window above the bank. Marshal Pritchett read the letter 3 times by lamplight in his office, his face growing harder with each pass. When he finished, he set it down carefully, like it might catch fire. "This changes things," he said. "Written testimony from the victim. Dated. Specific threat documented." He looked at Caleb. "But the council's still voting tomorrow morning to remove Rosie from your custody. Once that happens, Vernon takes her and this letter disappears along with everything else. So what do we do? Pritchett leaned back in his chair, thinking. Then, we call a community hearing, tonight. Full assembly. Frontier justice tradition. When the law's too slow, the people decide. Vernon won't come. He will, if I make it official. If I tell him the council's moved up their vote, needs his testimony to finalize custody transfer. Pritchett stood, already reaching for his coat. Get Esther, get anyone you trust. We're doing this at your barn, neutral ground, and it puts Vernon on your territory for once. By midnight, word had spread. Wagons arrived in the darkness, lanterns swinging, voices hushed. Neighbors, ranch hands, townspeople who'd stayed silent until now. They gathered in Caleb's barn, the same barn Vernon's men had tried to burn. Someone had swept it clean, hung extra lamps from the rafters. The smell of hay and leather mixed with the cold night air. Esther stood near the door, checking off names. The blacksmith came, the schoolteacher, Silas Drummond, and 3 other ranchers. Even Mrs. Hewitt arrived, her face pinched with uncertainty. Jacob Brenner came last, his hat pulled low, standing at the back like he might bolt any second. Caleb stood with Rosie near the makeshift speaker's platform, just 2 hay bales stacked high. The girl's hand was cold in his, her face pale but determined. At midnight, Vernon's carriage arrived. He stepped down, flanked by his 2 territorial lawyers, their city suits looking absurd in the barn lamplight. Vernon's face was calm, but his eyes moved constantly, counting heads, calculating odds. "Marshal," he said smoothly, "I was told this was a council matter." "It is," Pritchett said. "The whole community's the council tonight. Frontier tradition. You're familiar with it, I'm sure." Vernon's smile thinned. "Mob rule, you mean?" "Justice," Pritchett corrected. "Now sit down. We've got evidence to present." The crowd settled into silence. Someone coughed. A horse stamped in its stall. The lamplight threw long shadows across the walls. Pritchett stepped onto the platform. "We're here to decide the custody of Rosalie Brenner and the ownership of the Silas Brenner homestead. Mr. Giddings claims legal guardianship based on a will and deed of sale. Mr. Thorne disputes both documents as forgeries. We're going to hear all evidence, and then this community's going to vote." He nodded to Esther. She stepped forward with the homestead patent, unfolded it for all to see. "This is the original land grant," she said, her voice carrying. "Issued 1880 by the Territorial Land Office. It proves Silas Brenner owned 160 acres free and clear, no sale, no lien, nothing." One of Vernon's lawyers stood. "That document could be forged just as easily as—" "It's got a gold federal seal and a registrar's signature." Esther cut him off. "You want to call Washington City a forger?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Vernon's face remained smooth, but his fingers drummed once on his knee. Pritchett held up the letter next. "This is written by Emily Brenner, Rosie's mother, dated February 10th, 2 weeks before she and her husband died. In it, she documents a direct threat from Vernon Giddings." He read it aloud, every word clear and damning. The barn went dead silent. Vernon stood slowly. "That letter is a fabrication. Convenient, isn't it? Appears just when Thorne's about to lose custody?" "It was hidden in the satchel," Rosie said, her voice small but steady. "Mama sewed it there. She told Grandpa where to look if something happened." "A child's testimony," Vernon said dismissively. "Coached, obviously." "I ain't coached," Rosie stepped forward. "I saw you. At the river camp, you poured poison in Papa's coffee cup from a little brown bottle. You waited till Mama turned away, and you poured it in." Vernon's smile never wavered. "Grief and imagination, gentlemen. Tragic, but hardly evidence." "Then explain this," Pritchett said. He pulled a small glass bottle from his pocket. "Found in your desk during a search this afternoon. Arsenic trioxide, half empty." He held it up to the lamplight. "Funny thing, Doc says arsenic poisoning looks a lot like typhoid. Easy to mistake if you're not looking close." Vernon's face went white. "You had no authority to search my property." "I had a complaint of arson. That gives me authority to search anything I damn well please." Pritchett turned to the crowd. "I also found Vernon's personal ledger, the real one, not the public books. Shows payments to 3 railroad men last month, same 3 who tried to burn this barn Monday night." The barn erupted, voices shouting, some demanding answers, others calling for Vernon's arrest. The banker's lawyers moved closer to their client, their faces pale. Then Jacob Brenner stepped forward from the back. "I got something to say." The crowd quieted. Jacob's hands shook, but he kept walking until he stood in the center, visible to everyone. "My name's Jacob Brenner. Silas was my uncle." And Vernon Giddings paid me $50 to witness a false will. His voice broke. He said Silas wanted me there, wanted family involved, but I never saw Silas sign nothing. Vernon just showed me a paper with an X on it and told me to sign as witness, said it was a formality. Vernon lunged. You lying. Pritchett caught him by the arm. Sit down. He's in debt to me. He'll say anything to... I said sit down. Jacob's face was streaming with tears now. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to Silas, to Rosie, to everyone. I was weak. I needed the money. But I can't. I won't lie anymore. He looked at Rosie. Your grandpa deserved better. Your parents deserve better. And you deserve the truth. The silence that followed was absolute. Pritchett turned to Vernon. You want to keep denying, or you want to save what's left of your reputation and confess? Vernon's composure cracked, his face twisted with rage. That land is worth $20,000 when the railroad comes through. $20,000. And it was rotting in the hands of an old fool too stupid to see what he had. He jabbed a finger at Rosie. She's a child. What's she going to do with it? I could have built something. I could have... You could have asked, Caleb said quietly. Instead of killing. Vernon's mouth snapped shut. Around the barn, the faces staring back at him were stone. Marshal Pritchett pulled out his handcuffs. Vernon Giddings, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit murder, and 2 counts of murder by poison. The steel clicked around Vernon's wrists. His lawyers backed away, leaving him standing alone in the lamplight. The crowd erupted in approval. Not cheers, but something heavier. Relief. Justice. The sound of a wound finally being cleaned. The territorial judge arrived 3 days later, a gray-haired man named Carver, who'd seen enough frontier justice to know when to uphold it. He reviewed the evidence in Marshal Pritchett's office. The patent, the letter, Jacob's sworn testimony, the arsenic bottle, and rendered his decision before noon. Guardianship of Rosalie Brenner is hereby granted to Caleb Thorne, permanent and irrevocable. The Silas Brenner homestead, 160 acres, is confirmed as the legal property of said minor, with Mr. Thorne serving as trustee until she reaches majority. Vernon Giddings was remanded to territorial prison pending trial. The charges, 2 counts of murder, conspiracy, fraud, forgery, and attempted arson. 20 years minimum, the judge said. More likely life. As the prison wagon rolled out of town, Vernon sat in chains, his face empty of everything but defeat. No one came to see him off, not even his lawyers. That afternoon, the community gathered again. Not in judgment this time, but in restitution. The collection started at the general store, coins and bills piling up in a wash basin on the counter, $5 from the blacksmith, $10 from Silas Drummond. Even Mrs. Hewitt contributed $2, her face red with shame. By evening, they'd raised $240. Esther brought it to the ranch in a canvas sack, set it on Caleb's kitchen table. For the loan payment, and the rest is for feed, lumber, whatever you need. Caleb stared at the money, his throat tight. I can't. You can, and you will, Esther said firmly. We failed Silas. We failed his son and daughter-in-law. We're not failing this girl. She squeezed his shoulder. Besides, half this town owes you for standing up when the rest of us were too scared. Let us pay that debt. The next morning, Caleb rode into town and paid off the bank loan in full. The new manager, a nervous clerk promoted after Vernon's arrest, stamped the receipt with shaking hands and handed over the deed. Property's yours, Mr. Thorne, free and clear. Walking out into the sunlight, Caleb felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been clenched tight for 8 years. Spring came early that year. By mid-April, the willows along the river were thick with green buds. The ice broke with sounds like distant thunder, and the water ran clear and cold, carrying winter away. On the first Sunday in May, they held a ceremony. Not in the church, but at the ranch, in the newly rebuilt barn. The whole community came, families in their Sunday clothes, children running between wagons, the smell of roasted beef and fresh bread filling the air. At the center of the barn, Caleb had set up his branding station. The fire burned hot and clean, the iron resting in the coals. He'd had the blacksmith forge a new brand, not just his CT mark, but combined with Silas's SB, the 2 sets of letters intertwined like clasped hands. Rosie stood beside him, wearing a new dress Esther had sewn. Her hair was braided with ribbon, her face bright with something that looked almost like joy. You ready? Caleb asked. She nodded. He pulled the iron from the fire, its tip glowing orange. Together, his hand over hers, guiding but not controlling, they pressed it to the first calf's hide. The smell of singed hair and hide rose up, the brand seared clean and permanent, CTSB. The crowd applauded. Someone struck up a fiddle. Children laughed. After the branding, they walked to the river. 3 willow saplings waited, their roots wrapped in burlap. Rosie carried one, Caleb the others. They planted them at the graves, one for Emily, one for James, one for Silas. Rosie knelt in the soft earth, patting the soil around her mother's tree. "I kept the paper safe, Mama," she whispered, "just like you said. And I got a papa now, not by blood, but—" She looked up at Caleb. "But by something stronger." Caleb's vision blurred. He knelt beside her, helped tamp down the earth. "They'd be proud of you," he said quietly. "I know I am." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders. Across the river, meadowlarks were singing. The air smelled of turned earth and possibility. "What do we do now?" Rosie asked. Caleb looked out over the land. 160 acres of Montana territory, hard-won and finally free. His land now, in trust. Her land, by right. "Now?" he smiled. "Now we build." That evening, as the sun set and the guests departed, Caleb, Mauricio, and Rosie sat on the porch. The ranch stretched before them, fences mended, barn rebuilt, cattle grazing in the long spring grass. The river murmured in the distance, no longer a place of death, but of life returning. Rosie leaned against the porch post, her eyes half closed with exhaustion and contentment. "Caleb?" "Yeah?" "Thank you for not giving up." He looked at her, this small, fierce girl who'd survived winter and worse, who'd kept her family's truth hidden and safe until the world was ready to hear it. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me something worth fighting for." The stars came out one by one, bright and cold and faithful. And in the house behind them, a lamp burned warm in the window, not a signal of danger anymore, but simply home. Now, I reckon there's folks who'll say the law should have handled Vernon from the start. Maybe so, but out here, the law is only as strong as the men willing to stand behind it. And that winter, it took a dying child's whisper to wake up a whole town's conscience. Caleb Thorne didn't set out to be a father again. Truth be told, he'd buried that dream with his wife and unborn son 8 years prior. But sometimes, God's got a way of giving you what you need, not what you asked for. That little girl needed a home. That old rancher needed a reason to keep waking up. And somehow, through all the frozen mud and legal papers and barn smoke, they became family, not by blood, but by choice. The kind of choice that cost you something. Come June, those willow saplings stood tall as a man's belt buckle. Rosie watered them every Sunday after church, and the river ran clear again, and the meadowlarks came back singing like they'd never left. Vernon Giddings got 20 years in territorial prison. They say he never spoke another word after sentencing. Some men die before they stop breathing. As for Caleb and Rosie, well, they're still working that ranch. She's got a gift with horses, turns out. Taught herself to read, using Silas's old Bible. And every spring during branding, she runs that iron herself. CTSB pressed into hide, a mark that says, "This is ours. We earned it. We kept it safe." If you're watching this tonight and you've ever felt too broken to be useful, too old to start over, too alone to matter, remember Caleb Thorne. Remember a frozen riverbank and a whisper that changed everything. Because sometimes the most important thing you'll ever do is just show up when someone else has given up. That's all. Just show up. The rest, God'll handle. Amen.